Welcome, everybody, to North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange's student webinar series. I am Eric Evanson, NAFSE's Science Communications Specialist, and the goal of our series is to connect students with fire practitioners and develop positive working relationships, as well as sharing information. And before we get started, speaking of sharing information, what I'd like to have all of you do is go in the chat room and go ahead and put in your name and your affiliation. All right, welcome Danielle, Abby, Joshua. Grace is here, John is here. Thank you for joining. Peter, we'll see your name next week, I hope. Welcome, Will, Martin. Appreciate everybody coming on today. Steve, Dave, Robert, welcome. John, I recognize your name. Retired Maine Forest Ranger. I myself, of course, being retired. Tom Gerber, welcome. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, today's talk is entitled Forest Health in the Ossipee and Waterboro Pine Barrens, awaiting the arrival of the Southern Pine Beetle. And our presenter today is Sonya Kaufman. And Sonya graduated from the University of Vermont's Field Naturalist Master's Program back in May of 2023. She has worked in wildland and prescribed fire for 8 years with the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. So the way it's going to work out with our presentation today, Sonya is going to go ahead and share her presentation with us first, and then we'll follow up with a question and answer session after that. Now, feel free as we go along to put questions in the chat, and again, we'll address those at the end of Sonya's presentation. And then I'd like to close out our hour today, which is some additional information related to any upcoming talks that we have and ways that you can also get involved in the student webinar series. So let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. And Sonya, if there's anything else you'd like to share about yourself before your presentation, we'd love to learn more about you. So go ahead, Sonya.
Thanks, Eric, for that introduction. So as you already know, I'm Sonya. I'm talking to you today from my apartment here in Burlington, Vermont. And this afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you about research I conducted at the University of Vermont, looking at forest health in the Ossipee and Waterboro Pine Barrens, in context of the imminent arrival of the Southern Pine Beetle. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, and then I'll give you more background about me. But so just the greater context, that my research is part of a regional assessment of pitch pine barrens across the Northeast, a project which was designed by my advisor in the forestry department at UVM, Tony D'Amato, and Kevin Dodds, an entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service. The work I'll be talking about today is a small piece of Tony and Kevin's larger research on pine barrens' health and resilience. Before I dive into the research, I'm going to tell you a bit more about me and what led me to end up here today, talking about the Southern Pine Beetle and forest management. So I have to credit the Washington Conservation Corps with the start of my natural resources work. After graduating from Oberlin College with a degree in biology in 2013, I moved to Washington without ever having been to the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to put the conservation concepts I'd been learning about in school into action. So I worked at a native plants nursery where I planted trees, removed invasives, and learned how to use a whole bunch of tools that I'd never had to use growing up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. The Conservation Corps also exposed me to the world of natural disaster response and wildland firefighting, which I doubt I would have encountered otherwise. After catching the fire bug, as some might say, I continued to work on wildland fire crews for the National Park Service, as Eric just mentioned, for Olympic National Park, and the US Forest Service for 5 years. I worked all across Washington State, Oregon, Arizona, California, and Alaska, mostly as a member of 20-person hand crews and often the only woman on those crews. This is a photo from an early morning initial attack fire in central Washington, near Chelan, if you're familiar, on the slopes above the Columbia River. And then in 2019, I started spending my winters in South Carolina, not only to surf in the ocean near Charleston, but to conduct controlled burns with the Nature Conservancy. I started integrating my academic background in biology and conservation with my operational skills as a firefighter, and we put a lot of fire on the ground, mostly to protect red cockaded woodpecker habitat in longleaf pine forests of the Southeast. This is a photo from a burn I was on in 2019. This is the crews from TNC's North Carolina and South Carolina chapters. I then came to the Field Naturalist program at the University of Vermont just over 2 years ago in August 2021, with a desire to further ground my work in the field with a scientific and quantitative lens, and honestly also to take a break from manual labor. The Field Naturalist program is an interdisciplinary field ecology master's program that focuses on understanding why landscapes are the way they are, from the geology and geologic history to the soils, plants, wildlife, human history, climate, and more. I came into the program knowing that I wanted to incorporate fire ecology in some way, and was lucky to find Tony and Kevin's pitch pine research that combined everything I was looking for. It was actually thanks to an email update from NAFSE that I found out about their research, so I'm very grateful for that, and you all should sign up for their email updates. I then graduated from the Field Naturalist program in May of this year, and now I'm currently working as a prescribed fire practitioner for the Nature Conservancy's North American Fire Program. We're a national team of fire professionals who get sent around the country to help support and expand the use of prescribed fire nationally and also internationally. I just returned a couple days ago from a 2-week assignment on the Payette National Forest in Idaho. This is the awesome team I got to work with out there, and a little video of some burning of slash that we were doing. Gotta have some fire in a fire presentation. So now you know a little bit more about me. I want to introduce you to the real star of the show here today, Pitch Pine Barrens. This is a photo from the Ossipee Pine Barrens in New Hampshire from my summer of fieldwork there in 2022. This is a classic view of a pine barrens forest. Pitch pine barrens are quite unlike the northern hardwoods that we have here in Vermont, and maybe unlike the forest many of you are used to where you live, although I'm seeing a lot of folks who live near pitch pines, which is awesome. So if you're unfamiliar, the two main plants you can see here in this photo are pitch pines. Those are the trees with the dark green needles, and scrub oak, which are the bright green shrubs along the bottom. Pine barrens are found on coastal sand plains and sandy glacial outwash deposits of major river valleys, conditions that were created through historic glacial activity and the rocks and sediments that were left behind. Soils are well drained, nutrient poor, and acidic, and pine barrens are fire adapted. Many of the plants that grow there actually require fire to successfully regenerate. Pine barrens are a globally rare ecosystem type with a G2 ranking, meaning that there are only 6 to 20 occurrences of this ecosystem worldwide. This rare forest type is home to many other rare, threatened, and endangered species. Notably, many rare plants, birds, and moths require pitch pine barrens habitats to survive. And there are several reasons for why these pine barrens are so rare. One is the specific soil conditions they required. 2, developers love to build houses and buildings on their well-draining sandy soil. And 3, effects from colonization. Pitch pine is not a desirable lumber species, so when Europeans colonized the Northeast, pitch pines were targeted for harvesting, and fast-growing white pines, which are not tolerant to fire, were planted in their place. Colonists pushed native peoples out of the land they had stewarded for millennia, people who actively used fires to clear land, open areas for hunting, and regenerate plants like blueberries for food. This combination of intense harvesting, planting white pines, excluding fire, and expelling the people who were stewarding these forests started the pattern towards mesification in the Pine Barrens. Mesification is the process that occurs when fire is removed from a fire-dependent forest. So open, sunny, fire-tolerant forests shift to closed, shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive forests. And I wanted to throw this photo in to show you the proof that the Waterboro Barren sits on 90 feet of sandy soils that were deposited by glaciers. This is a really special spot in the preserve that's kind of hard to find, but you can actually see that height of the sandy deposit. So the star of pitch pine barrens is the pitch pine itself. And here are some photos of pitch pines from my fieldwork last summer. Pitch pines, if you haven't seen them, hopefully you get to someday. They're a beautiful tree. They have reddish brown bark that forms wide plates and stiff dark green needles in bunches of 3. And they produce relatively large seeds that require exposed mineral soil to germinate. Fire and other types of disturbance are the most common ways to expose mineral soil. Pitch pines also have thick bark, which insulates them from flames, and their bark flakes off when it catches on fire, which both can help to spread fire and also extinguish burning on the tree itself. They thrive in nutrient-poor acidic soils where other tree species can't compete as well as they can. Other common plants you see in pine barrens include sweet fern in the upper left, lowbush blueberries in the lower left, pink lady slipper in the middle, sheep laurel on the bottom right, and that's a pitch pine seedling in the upper right. And this is not a plant, but an amazingly cute creature that I saw during my fieldwork last year. I just have to share it, a little baby porcupine that was in the middle of one of my vegetation plots. This is actually on our site in Vermont. Probably the cutest thing I've ever seen in the woods. So to get a sense of where these forests are located, here's a map of documented locations of the northeastern pine barrens. As you can see, these forests are disjointed. There's no direct way for species to travel between them. And there are both coastal and inland pine barrens, all defined by that specific combination of glacial deposits, sandy soil, pitch pines, scrub oak, lowbush blueberries, and the many rare species that depend upon them. The 2 main locations where I conducted my research are here circled in green, and that's the Ossipee Pine Barrens in New Hampshire and the Waterboro Barrens in Maine, and I'll explain more about those sites in a little bit. So now you know more about pitch pine barrens, and where they're located in the northeastern US. I want to introduce an important current threat to northeastern pine barrens, which is the Southern Pine Beetle. It's this beetle on the very far left that is smaller than a grain of rice. And this beetle is one of the most destructive bark beetles in the country. It's native to the southeastern United States, and when forests are actively managed, natural cycles of predators, parasitoids, and fungi keep the southern pine beetle in check. So it's only when forests become overstocked with high basal area and low spacing between trees that the beetles become a problem. Here's some photos of trees affected by southern pine beetles. The beetles usually attack trees at heights greater than 10 feet, and these popcorn-like clumps of pitch you see on the left are characteristic of how a tree responds to their attacks. The tree produces excess pitch in order to expel the beetles. But the best diagnostic feature is what happens under the bark, as you can see in the lower right. Once southern pine beetles enter a tree, they carve out galleries in which to lay their eggs. And these galleries are curved or S-shaped, and they eventually kill the tree by girdling it. They cut off nutrient flow through the xylem and phloem, and they can kill a tree in 2 to 4 months. So here's a photo from a southern pine beetle outbreak in Texas in the early 2000s. From 1998 to 2002, there was an extended pine beetle outbreak in the southeastern US that affected more than 1 million acres and caused over $1 billion of losses for timber producers. So hundreds of thousands of acres of trees can be killed in a single growing season. And a big reason for that is that southern pine beetles can produce multiple generations in a year. They produce up to 9 generations in a season in their traditional range of the southeast, and likely around 3 in the northeast. And the number of generations they lay per year is temperature dependent. So with warmer temperatures, their life cycle gets accelerated. To coordinate these massive attacks, beetles communicate through sophisticated chemical signaling or pheromones that cause them to aggregate together. And while at first they can only attack dead or dying trees, as their populations grow, they can attack perfectly healthy live trees. The southern pine beetles can exist in an area for years at low levels, not causing substantial damage to the forest. But once their populations grow large enough, they go into outbreak or infestation status, is what we call it. And these outbreaks move directionally in the direction of the prevailing wind on which their pheromones are carried. So in terms of thinking about fire danger, southern pine beetle outbreaks cause dramatic increases in fuel loading. The more trees they kill, the more large wood accumulates on the ground, which essentially just creates a pile of kindling that can dry and wait for the next spark. So just also as beetle infestations move in the direction of the prevailing wind, so do wildfires. So this potential for devastation of the forest is compounded. And I want to come back to this map to get a sense of the potential scale of damage by the southern pine beetle compared to the remaining area of northeastern pine barrens. Inland pine barrens make up only 42,742 acres, and coastal pine barrens make up 491,551 acres. The southern pine beetle outbreak of the early 2000s I was just talking about affected more than 1 million acres, which is approximately the same size as the state of Rhode Island and twice the size of all of the northeastern pitch pine barrens combined. To think more about the historic range of the southern pine beetle and how it has expanded, I'm going to show you a series of maps. First, here's the range of the southern pine beetle from a figure made in 1999. You can see that area in red is where the beetle was common, and the purple is where it was rare. Beetles are limited by minimum winter temperatures in their range. They die below air temperatures of about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, with warming winter temperatures, the southern pine beetle has been expanding their range north. They also overwinter in their host trees at all life stages. So their growth and development slows, dependent on temperature, but it doesn't stop unless temperatures are low enough to kill them. Here's the current documented range of the southern pine beetle. You can see how it has extended both to the west, all the way to Arizona, and all the way north into New York. And then here is a figure from Kevin Dodds showing where southern pine beetles have been detected in traps more recently, like in the last year. The black dots are places where beetles were detected in traps this year. And also, it's not shown on this map, but infested trees were found in Massachusetts both this year and last year on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. But just to clarify this a little bit, detections in a trap, are those black dots, are different from full-blown infestations. You can find beetles in a trap without finding any infested trees, and that indicates that there are low populations of beetles in that area, but they haven't yet reached outbreak status. Once trees do show signs of damage from southern pine beetles, those populations can grow quite quickly and a rapid response is needed. These trees in Massachusetts, where they found trees to be infested by southern pine beetles, those are the first infestations found north of Long Island. And luckily, resource managers reacted quite quickly to suppress them. And by that, so suppression is a term we use in fire and also use in beetle management. So in this case, suppression means cutting down all the affected trees and sometimes even like a buffer around those trees. Vermont is actually the only state in the Northeast that has yet to detect southern pine beetles. This northward trend is only going to continue, so right now is the time to be taking action and implementing forest management to prevent future destruction from the southern pine beetle. But how do we do that? So here, first I'll show this map from the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program in the Southeast. As I mentioned before, these beetles are native to the southeastern US, where they target loblolly and shortleaf pines. And beetle management has been going on there for years. It's just a novel pest to us here in the north. So on this map, you can see where thinning has taken place in purple and blue, prescribed burns in red, planting in green, and longleaf pine restoration in yellow. The two main forest management strategies to limit the spread of the southern pine beetle are prescribed fire and thinning, and their combination. Prescribed fire reduces understory competition, lowers tree density, creates patches of mineral soil for pitch pine seedlings to regenerate, and is a natural disturbance in pine barrens forests. This picture on the left is from a burn I worked on at Wells Barrens Preserve in southern Maine, which is managed by the Nature Conservancy. This was last fall as part of the first ever Maine prescribed fire training exchange. And these are lowbush blueberries that are burning, which are a very important component of pine barrens. And then the other strategy for limiting southern pine beetle spread is thinning or harvesting trees. Thinning increases airflow between trees so that beetle pheromones are less effective. It reduces competition between the trees, allowing more water and nutrients to be allocated towards each tree, which improves their individual health and resilience to beetle attacks. Reducing basal area to below 80 square feet per acre has been proven to be ideal for preventing southern pine beetle outbreaks. You can see two examples here of thinning for bark beetle management, and the photo on the right is a photo I took of a thin stand at the Ossipee Pine Barrens. So with all of that background, I now want to introduce the specific research that I worked on while at UVM. As I mentioned earlier, my research is part of a larger project led by Kevin Dodds and Tony D'Amato, and here's a map of all of their survey locations for the project. These three dots in yellow are the locations where I collected data. I'll focus mostly on the Ossipee and Waterboro Barrens preserves, but I'll also include some information from the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, and that's at a site they refer to as Pitch Pine Knob. So here's another map. We're zooming in on the Ossipee Pine Barrens in New Hampshire. That's on the left in yellow. It's about 2,000 acres. And the Waterboro Barrens in Maine on the right in red, about 3,000 acres. These two sites are just about an hour apart from each other. And they're managed by two different state chapters of the Nature Conservancy. Ossipee has been managed since 2007 and Waterboro since 1993. These preserves are the largest intact examples of pitch pine barrens in their respective states, and they're being managed with restoration and stewardship priorities. And again, they're only 2,000 and 3,000 acres, pretty small. They are both home to rare butterfly, moth, plant, and bird species, many of which who require those pine barrens to survive. To the research itself, so here's a map of where we worked at Ossipee and Waterboro. We first identified stands throughout both preserves that had been managed with one of four treatments. So we have prescribed fire only, shown in orange, mechanical harvest only, shown in green, the combination of harvest and fire in red, and then no management in purple. But these preserves had been affected by wildfires and logging in the past, so even if an area is labeled no management, it had been affected by some forms of disturbance at some point. We surveyed 3 plots in each stand, and the locations of those plots are shown by the small blue circles. Here's an overall diagram of one of our plots. So in each of these survey stands, we conducted 3 400-meter squared plots, and we chose plot locations to be representative of the stand as a whole. Within the plot, we surveyed every tree with a diameter at breast height of greater than 7.5 centimeters or 3 inches. We also did subplots for saplings and seedlings. Those are the teal and the yellow circles. Here's a photo of my field assistant Ryan Hawley taking a diameter reading of one overstory pitch pine tree. This research really could not have been possible without Ryan's help. He helped me nearly every single day at all 3 field sites, and then also once we got home and were processing tree cores. So to talk a little bit more about what we were looking at with the overstory trees, we noted the species, measured DBH, the diameter at breast height. We determined the crown class, if it was dominant, codominant, intermediate, or overtopped, a descriptor that is determined by how much light hits the crown of the tree. The percent canopy cover, so what percentage of the height of the tree is covered by live foliage. Tree decline stage, following this metric, how live or dead the tree is. And we noted any insect or disease damage. We did this for 1,260 trees across all of our field sites. For every live tree, we also took one tree core with an increment borer. You can see on the left how the borer goes into the tree. The borer is shaped like a T with a razor sharp drill bit on the end, and you turn those blue handles to drill into the tree. We took tree cores from as low down on the trunk as possible to capture the maximum number of tree rings, so we can most accurately date the trees. Here's what the cores looked like when we packaged them up in straws, labeled them by plot and by site. And this is just a portion of all the cores we took. These are all of the Green Mountain cores and less than half of the Ossipee cores. So by the end of the summer, we had 1,024 tree cores, and the fun wasn't over yet. Each core had to be sanded, first dried, mounted onto a wooden mount, then sanded, and then rings counted under a microscope. So here's the process unfolding first from my dining table when I was mounting the cores to actually counting the rings at the UVM forestry lab. I also had a lot of help from Ryan on this, and two folks, Chris Hansen and Pete Clark from UVM, were immensely helpful in teaching me about dendrochronology. By the time we were done, we had counted 49,770 tree rings. And then the next step here is to measure the width of every ring in order to understand growth dynamics of the forest and how they're affected by climate and forest management. And that work is still ongoing. So back to this diagram, and I'll tell you a bit more about the sapling and seedling plots, those smaller circles in the teal and the yellow. We located the sapling and seedling plots along azimuths of 0, 120, and 240 degrees. And they had their centers at 5.5 meters from the center of the overstory plot. Within these smaller radius plots, all saplings were counted from within the teal circles. Those teal circles had a 2.8 meter radius, and saplings were any woody plants greater than 1 inch in diameter and less than 3 inches diameter. And then seedlings were counted in those smaller subplots with a 1.8 meter radius, and seedlings were any woody plant less than 1 inch in diameter. Here's a photo of Ryan setting up the start of a plot. We use those pink flags you can see on the right to mark the perimeter of the seedling sapling plots, and the blue stake with an orange dot on top on the left of the photo is the center of the overstory plot. This was at Waterboro, so this is sort of a representative stand in Waterboro. Many hours were spent hunched over just like this, trying to decide if a seedling was a white pine or a pitch pine. The number of needles can be very hard to see when they're that small, or trying to decide if something's a serviceberry or American beech. By the end of the summer, we counted 8,651 seedlings and 244 saplings. And here's a pitch pine seedling on the right. They were a prize site. This was in a burned unit. You can see a bit of scorch on the tree in the ground. Pitch pine seedlings were pretty rare to find across all of the sites. And another student from UVM, Kathleen Stutzman, is conducting research about pitch pine seedling regeneration and how it is affected by management. So stay tuned. I think she's presenting on that next spring. I'm really interested to see what she found. So moving into the results, I'm going to share just a portion of my results with you as we collected a huge amount of data. I'll touch on results from the overstory tree assessment, tree cores, saplings, and seedlings. And to start, here's a graph of overstory basal area, which is I've mentioned this a couple times, but the cross-sectional area of trees at breast height. So overstory basal area across treatment types and sites. On the x-axis here, we have the 4 treatment types And on the y-axis, we have basal area in feet squared per acre. And Waterboro is in red, Ossipee is in yellow. And then this red horizontal line going across the graph represents the recommended threshold of 80 square feet per acre for limiting southern pine beetle infestations. So you can see the only stands that had basal areas below 80 square feet per acre were those harvest only and harvest and fire stands. But even so, they're only just barely below 80. And then no management stands had the highest basal area. Another measurement of pitch pine barrens health is the importance values of pitch pine. Importance values are a combined value based on relative basal area and relative density of a tree species, and it ranges from 0 to 100. So here again, we have treatment type on the x-axis and then importance value on the y. And in pine barrens, the higher importance value of pitch pine, the better. So here you can see that the highest pitch pine importance values were in the fire only and the harvest and fire stands, with another high value at the Waterboro harvest only stands. So now onto the tree core data. Here I have a separate graph for each treatment at the Ossipee Pine Barrens. We have no management in the upper left, harvest only in the upper right, fire only in the lower left, and then harvest and fire in the lower right. On the x-axis is the recruitment year, so that's the year that a tree started growing. And we determined recruitment by counting the number of rings on a tree core to the innermost tree ring. And then on the y-axis is the number of trees. I just want to point out a couple more things. So first, we have these orange fire icons, and that represents years in which prescribed burns took place. The cut stump represent years when thinning took place. And then the red fire icon represents wildfires that affected those corresponding stands. Research from Bill Patterson in 2001 suggests that Ossipee had widespread fires in 1898, 1905, and 1912, and parts of Ossipee also burned in 1957. So looking at where those fires affected these corresponding stands, you can see that pitch pine recruitment increased following those late 1800s and early 1900 fires. And then the other pattern I want to show you is the shift in which species are present based on forest management. So we have pitch pine in that dark red, white pine is in yellow, red maple in teal, and American beech in dark blue. White pine, red maple, and beech are not tolerant to fire, and this is reflected by their lack of presence in the sites that include fire and management. You can see that those areas that used fire and management are really dominated by pitch pines. And then the no management stands, in contrast, have a stark transition to non-fire adapted trees about 50 years following the last major wildfire. So here we have recruitment at Waterboro, and these trends are more subtle but similar. The fires of 1947 that burned over 220,000 acres in Maine swept through Waterboro, and that's symbolized by the red fire icon. And we see minimal recruitment of trees prior to 1947. Those fires were mostly stand replacing, but you can see evidence of several trees that survived them. And similarly to Ossipee, Waterboro has more fire intolerant trees in the areas without fire and management, but pitch pine did dominate recruitment in all of the treatments. And then I just want a quick comparison to the results from our research at the Green Mountain National Forest site, Pitch Pine Knob. This site is a bit different. It was on a pitch pine rocky heath summit, not a sandy outwash plain, so the natural community is different from standard pine barrens. You can't compare it directly to Ossipee and Waterboro, but it's still interesting to look at the patterns. And there also has been no recorded active management of pitch pine knob by the US Forest Service. So the mesification of this forest is pretty striking. You can see the pitch pines, which are still that dark red, start to dwindle. And then white pine, red maple, red oak, and chestnut oak take over. And then in the last 30 years, white pine is the only tree regenerating. And there's been no pitch pine recruitment since the 1940s. So moving from the overstory to the sapling results, here we have relative density of saplings summarized from the sapling plots across Ossipee. Scrub oak is in orange, pitch pine still that dark red, red maple in teal, white pine in yellow, and American beech in blue. So you can see that pitch pine saplings were most prevalent in harvest-only stands, and no management stands had the highest proportion of fire-intolerant species. You can see at least 50% of the no management saplings are the red maple, beech, and white pine that can't survive fire. Scrub oak made up a huge component of all the stands. And then there's another interesting pattern here. So in stands managed with fire, you can see that scrub oak made up more than 50% of all the saplings, and stands managed without fire, scrub oak made up less than 50% of all saplings. The Waterboro sapling trends are different. Here, the only saplings we found in harvest and fire stands were pitch pine. But again, there were more fire intolerant species in the no management stands. And also just keep in mind, very few saplings were found overall at Waterboro. So these percentages are really only reflecting a handful of trees. And then next I'll go through the seedlings. At Ossipee, you can see a high proportion of scrub oak seedlings still in that orange. And pitch pine seedlings are only present in the managed stands. There were none found at all in the no management stands. The relative density of pitch pine seedlings was approximately equal across the three management types, but slightly higher in the harvest and fire stands. And there was just a high diversity of seedling species across all stands. Another pattern is that stands without fire had a higher proportion of white pine seedlings than those managed with fire. And then for the seedlings at Waterboro, scrub oak made up more than 50% of seedling relative density in all stands. The highest proportion of red maple seedlings were found in no management stands, followed by harvest only. And then only a minimal amount were found in stands managed with fire. Here, pitch pine seedlings were found in all treatment types, but the highest proportion by far was in the harvest and fire stands. And actually, out of 184 pitch pine seedlings we found in the entire preserve, 140 of those were found in these areas managed with harvesting and fire. So again, just to compare to the pitch pine knob, no pitch pine saplings were found at all on the Green Mountain site, and the large majority of saplings were fire intolerant. The red maple, white pine, and sweet birch made up the majority. And then seedlings at pitch pine knob also, there were no pitch pine seedlings, but there was a mix of fire tolerant and fire intolerant species, with a large proportion of serviceberry and chestnut oak, which are fire tolerant, but also a lot of red maple, white pine, and American beech, which are not. So to wrap things up, as I've sifted through all of my results, I've noticed overall patterns that harvest and fire treatments at both Ossipee and Waterboro resulted in the best conditions for presenting southern pine beetle outbreaks, and that's lower stand basal area, higher pitch pine overstory importance values, pitch pine diversity across size and crown classes, and just less fire intolerant species recruitment, as compared to the no management stands at Waterboro and Ossipee, which had higher stand basal area, lower pitch pine importance values, less pitch pine recruitment, trends in mesification over time for seedlings, saplings, and overstory trees, and also more standing dead wood. But I do want to leave you on a message of hope. We're in a really good place to be able to work proactively and prevent destruction of this rare habitat. Land managers are working together across the East Coast to share advice about managing the Pine Barrens, and the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange has been instrumental in creating a Southern Pine Beetle working group to help that happen. I'm hopeful that my research can be another piece in the puzzle of supporting the restoration and resilience of these rare northeastern pitch pine barrens. And yeah, I'll wrap this up and just say a huge thank you to Tony D'Amato, my advisor, guided me through everything, and Kevin Dodds at the Forest Service, who has been a great mentor. My committee from UVM, Tony D'Amato, Shelley Rayback, and Aaron Lane, And our project partners at TNC New Hampshire, Jeff Luigi and Mike Crawford, and TNC Maine, John Bailey, and Ryan, who this picture on the left really indicates what our summer looked like. He was mostly fighting his way through scrub oak like that. And it was a tough summer, but it was really fun. I just want to thank everyone else on this slide and other folks who've supported me and all of you for tuning in today. Thank you so much. And we can open
All
it up for
right.
questions.
Well, thank you very much, Sonia. Very enlightening. I have a question and a comment. Since I'm still relatively new to some of this stuff, the I hope this isn't too silly, but how do forestry personnel monitor if trees are affected by Southern Pine Beetle? I mean, how do you know to kind of put traps out in advance, or where might you, do something like that? I guess I'm just, how, is it
Yeah.
monitored weekly, daily, things like that?
No, that's a great question. I don't have super specific answers, but aerial surveys are really helpful. And I know just from watching the Southern Pine Beetle Working Group update from September, those infested trees in Massachusetts did show up on their aerial surveys. So I think having the plane flights go through and these spot infestations, as they're called, are they have like a very characteristic shape that you can see from thousands of feet up in the air. And then putting out the traps, it's a preventative thing just to put out traps in areas that you think they might appear, like where there are pitch pines. That's where the first pine beetles in Maine were found. They just put them up at Waterboro. They hadn't seen any signs of them, but they put them up and they found some beetles.
Okay. Thanks for that question. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or I'm going to open up your cameras and be able to unmute you in just a moment, and you can ask questions that way. I guess one other comment, the one thing I was reading about Southern Pine Beetle, about the idea of, with the warmer temperatures and how they're able to survive a little bit longer. Prior to me joining NAFSE, I was a meteorologist with the National Weather Service for 33 years. And here in Burlington, Vermont, we did just a very informal study. Obviously we always hear about temperatures warming during the day and, very hot conditions, but we did a very informal study a few years ago looking at a variety of different sites across Vermont. And though actually what stuck out most to us was the warming temperatures at night. The conditions weren't getting as cold. And that clearly from some of the research I've been reading suggests that, by obviously being warmer at night, that's not allowing the kill factor to be increased with southern pine beetle. So I just be curious, thinking now, other areas in the Northeast, if that's kind of also seeing those types of trends of those warmer overnight temperatures, that it just, we tend to not seem to get as cold as we used to in the past.
Yeah, I would be really curious about that too. Um, it seems like if these beetles are surviving, they're in Massachusetts and they're surviving well enough to go into outbreak status, then it seems likely that that's happening in other places as well.
Okay, I've got a couple other questions here. Oh, of all the pitch pine barrens in the Northeast, why did you choose Ossipee and Waterboro? That's from David Peters.
That's a good question. Like I said earlier, they are these like standout examples. And I didn't personally choose. I really was guided by Kevin and Tony, and it was, like partially logistics. TNC New Hampshire was kind enough to give me a cabin to stay in. That's where this picture is from. I was on this beautiful lake in New Hampshire. So, with the logistics and needing to travel between multiple, we wanted to get multiple sites if we could. But we thought that those would be two great preserves to sort of kick off this research. And now I can go back to that map, but now they've really expanded. Let's see, where is it? They've really expanded the sites to all across the Northeast. So, and part of this isn't part of your question, but part of why I don't have statistics incorporated into this talk is because we're going to end up being able to put data from all of these different sites together to have like a much stronger statistical analysis at some point.
Okay. And then a comment and a question here from John Mitchell. A great presentation. Thank you. Any comments or observations on invasives? Are areas monitored, treated for invasives, particularly those that are burned and or thinned?
That's a great question. We really saw minimal invasives, just anecdotally in our surveys. I'm sure TNC is monitoring for them, but I don't have much more to say than that. Yeah, just anecdotally didn't see many.
Okay. Here's one from Robert. Do we know how well pitch pine seedlings and saplings survive subsequent fires, whether they be wildfires or prescribed? My understanding, possibly wrong, is that pitch pine systems historically saw relatively infrequent fire intervals with implications for prescribed fire intervals.
I think your understanding is pretty spot on. The seedlings don't survive fire very well. I know at Waterboro in Maine, John Bailey, the fire manager, tries to have intervals be at least 5 to 6 years between burns. So, I mean, in terms of big scale, like 5 to 6 years is relatively frequent. We can't burn there every year, but every 5 to 10 years, they'll get, tough enough to withstand a fire.
Okay. Nicholas says, great presentation, aerial detection, aggressive field checks, traps, proactive management are the best. Hope in the Northeast. That those are the things that are working here in Massachusetts. And then great work by Tom Gerber. And then another comment here from Lauren. Thanks for your presentation, Sonia. I'm struck by how different the Ossipee Pine Barrens look now versus back in 2001 when I did my doctoral research there. At that point, there was only one small experimental burn in one location. It's great to see the progress that's being made.
They're doing great work. Yeah, it's awesome. I really want to get out on a burn there. It's just a little, yeah, hard to work the schedule sometime.
And then final question here in the chat from Stephen. Great presentation of work. Thank you. Do you know why pitch pine recruitment is higher in the harvested areas than either the only fire and non-management?
Cool. Hi, Steve. Glad you're here. Um, so I don't know for sure, but my thought is just, the more disturbance, the better for pitch pines and honestly, getting those big trucks in and out of there, I'm sure it's disturbing the soil. And that could be a little bit more effective than, maybe the fire that went through isn't super intense and doesn't actually there. It's been so long since fire has been there that not enough mineral soil got exposed, and obviously non-management just like it's so dense. It's so dense in those non-managed sites that there's mineral soil is not getting exposed, not enough light is getting to the floor either.
Got it. So yes, I've allowed everyone to turn on their cameras and also unmute themselves. So if anyone has any questions or comments for Sonia, we'd be more than happy to have you interact at this point.
Cool. Should I stop my screen share or keep it up?
Totally up to you.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and stop your screen share? That might be easier to see any other people who have. I don't see any other. Does anyone have any other kind of questions or comments for Sonia?
Thanks for coming.
Great job, Sonia. Great job.
Thanks, Dad.
Keep it up.
Another comment here from Nicholas. Mechanical site prep is more predictable and efficient.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. I'm going to just let me bring up a couple of quick little items here before we close. I just want to remind you that we do have one more for our fall student webinar series, a talk next Thursday from Peter Breigenzer from the University of Maine. And his topic is forest structure drives fine scale variation in microclimate and fuel moisture in northern conifer forests. And so if you want to learn more about that, and also, let's see here, let me drop this in the chat. This is your link to the student webinar series. And we're going to have this recording and presentation up for you to review, or if you know somebody that maybe didn't get a chance to see it, that should be up on our website tomorrow. And I do see a note here, a direct message about proof of attendance for forestry credits. Yeah, Nicholas, actually, let me do this really quick. I'd like you to send me an email at this email address, and I can do that for you. And while I'm giving you that email address, if any of you know somebody who would like to give a presentation for our student webinar series, we are going to hopefully have one in the spring. And as we mentioned, we have one person already that wants to be involved next spring. So if you know of anybody, you can just reach out to my email there, and we can make something happen. I do have one more question here from David. Any idea how the pitch pine barrens of the Northeast compare to the jack pine barrens of the Great Lakes region?
I don't know. Do you know? Does anyone else know? I know jack pine is a somewhat similar pine to pitch pine, but I really don't, and I don't know about the Great Lakes region. But Tony, my advisor, knows. He used to work out there in Minnesota.
Okay. All right. Any final questions at all? All right. Then otherwise, again, Sonya, thank you so much. Very enlightening presentation. A lot of hard work went into your research there, and very enlightening. I learned quite a bit, and I'm sure everybody else did here too. I'll just leave this open for a few more minutes if anyone else needs to jump on for anything, but otherwise I'm going to stop the recording, and we'll call it a great day. So thank you everybody again for joining us, and we really appreciate the presentation, Sonya. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.